Good evening. Let's all stand. Jesus, hear my prayer. I want to see the lost come home, see the broken hearts made whole. Jesus, hear my prayer. I want to see the sick made well, see the world find love that's real. Jesus, hear my prayer. I want to see the hungry fed, see new lives rise from the light of the world. You stepped down into darkness, opened my eyes, you let me see beauty that made this heart adore you, hope of a life spent with you. Sing it out. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. King of all days, though so highly exalted, glorious in heaven above. Humbly you came to the earth you created, all for love's sake and became born. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. You're altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sins upon the cross. I'll never know how much it costs to see my sin upon the cross. So here I am to worship, here I am to bow down, here I am to say that you're my God. Altogether lovely, altogether worthy, altogether wonderful to me. Amen. You may be seated. Well, good evening once again, and Happy New Year to you. And it is communion weekend. We are going to start the new year out by having communion together. And I'd like to invite the servers and the ushers and whoever else comes up here during that time, if you would man your stations, please. And it's kind of interesting today for me. I wasn't supposed to do this. I was supposed to do it at a later time, but the way it worked out is I was asked to share today. For communion, as you see, they rotate the pastors, and it's kind of out of my element. So I believe it or not, I get real nervous when I have to be serious. But at the same time, I just wanted to say it's just wonderful that I get to do this on New Year's, because New Year's Eve, a little over 10 years ago, 11 years ago, is when I was saved. So for me, New Year's Eve always had an importance, because I used to play in a bar band before I was a Christian. And so New Year's Eve was always a good time. I mean, that was the time you went out and celebrated. And then one day on Rifle, I had to move to L.A. to get saved, from L.A. to get saved. But when I came to Colorado, I pulled over, and a God that I didn't even know encountered me and said there was something more to my life than what I was doing. And I asked in return that there had to be more for me. And on that New Year's Eve, that next day, it was actually the day before, New Year's Eve is when I came to the realization that something had happened in my life. And this New Year's Eve, of course, playing in a bar band, I was supposed to go play, and I did. I fulfilled my commitment, and I had the worst time, you guys. I had the worst time, and I finally figured out why I did. It's because I had encountered the true living God. And I didn't know the language. I didn't know the whole thing, but I knew something had happened. And I knew on New Year's Day that my life was new. Not only was it a new year, but my life was new. And some of you out there, whether you've been Christians all your life, some of you, I love your stories. You tell me, you've been a Christian since you were born. Wonder of your cross shall be our meditation. You may be seated.
This is my voice. And I don't mean to embarrass them, but I just thought I'd say it. How many of you came tonight expecting a New Year's resolution message? Just for the kicks of it. You just don't vote, do you? I forget that about you guys. You just don't vote. Well, anyway, it's not going to be that. But we're going to talk about, this is a one sermon series that I'm going to do. So I got to get it all packed in one message. I had a friend of mine that used to say, you don't watch your watch when I preach, you watch your calendar. That didn't go over well, and for you guests, that's not true. But anyway, I want you to turn into Colossians, and in this church, it's fair to go to your index and see where Colossians is, but we want to talk about living our lives in view of eternity. Reminders of values that are eternal, and that's what we want to talk about. The great paradox of Christianity. And this is so true, and I don't care where you are in your walk with the Lord, but where you see yourself and where you want to be. There's a tension in that. You see certain types of attributes that you're not really happy with, and you want to get rid of them, and yet they seem like they hang around for a while, and you really don't know why, but you see where you are, and then you see where you want to be. That snapshot of our life, if frozen in time, and we never progress through it, becomes a very discouraging state of mind to live in. It's like, I've had better times than living around, these kind of situations that I find myself living in, and I would just soon get on through it. People can disqualify themselves for any kind of future because of this dilemma of seeing no progress in their lives. Really becomes hugely discouraging to anybody when we don't see our lives progressing through at a certain point. It's laborious. It's difficult. It's like I'm not having any fun here. And this is exactly where Paul finds the church at Colossae. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this church at Colossae. Actually, Paul never had gone to this church. And it's in southern Turkey, actually, is where it's at. But he had heard about it, and he heard about some of the problems that they were going through, so he's writing back to them. And they had false teachers come through, and the church was kind of starting to break apart, and there were all sorts of problems that were coming up. And so Paul writes back to him. And now you have to think about this for just a minute, because Paul gets understanding as to what's going on. And it wasn't like they had email in those days. And so he has to think about what's happening, and then he writes back this letter that is hopefully going to change the mindset of this church, because they are stuck. They are not progressing. As a matter of fact, some of them might even think that they're going backwards. There was a popular author here not too long ago, well, maybe a decade or two ago, that talked about 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward. You feel like that sometimes? You're going forward and then you kind of go back. Well, that's kind of where these people were. And it was like Paul is trying to say to them, I want you to get over this hump. And so what he begins to say to them about this mindset is really kind of mind-boggling to me. Something that is actually going to motivate them through this barrier that they find themselves in. Maybe some of us here this evening find ourselves in that very same place, is that we just can't break through in certain areas of our life. And Paul uses a concept, and it's called eternity. He says, I want you to get a concept about eternity. I want you to think about this life as something that's very, very short. Now, I think it's really important for us at this point to stop and say something here. That sometimes I think it's very true of the church that we become so heavenly minded, and I hate cliches, but I think this one is true, that we're of no earthly value. But at sometimes, and actually the New Testament church was immersed in this whole idea about when Christ was going to come back, and the understanding of what eternity was all about, and that we're not just living our lives for what we see here. And so he begins to paint this picture about, I want your mind to think about things that are above. You know, and honestly, friends, if we went around the room tonight and said, how often do you really think about eternity? What would be your answer? I mean, how often? And I think that God even programs us to think about eternity. As a matter of fact, as a pastor, I can say that there's a large percentage of people that do not want to think about death simply over that issue. And yet death is something that all of us have in our consciousness of knowing, as another year has progressed by, that date is getting closer. And if you don't believe that, friends, you are living in ultimate denial. It is going to happen. Your day is going to come, just like anybody else's day. Your day is going to be in the box. And the idea of it is that we begin to contemplate from that perspective about the actions that we are actually taking today. And so people have a really difficult time seeing the big picture. And I've just found this out to be very true. When people don't see the big picture, it is really difficult for them to get a picture of it, to even understand it. As a matter of fact, now, ladies, don't get mad at me, but this is something that I read in Proverbs, and it's about your gender, but I want you to know that men suffer from the same problem. But listen to this. In Proverbs 14:1, a wise woman builds her house, while a foolish woman tears her down by her own effort. Now, this is going to take a minute to explain that so that you still love me when you walk out of here, ladies. But anyway, the idea of it is this. Anybody that gets stuck on a particular problem that doesn't see the big picture has the tendency to do one thing. And that is tear down whatever is being built right now. Have you ever thought about the concept about cut your nose off to spite your face? Or you're making a mountain out of a molehill? And really, friends, at some point you and I have to come to a place in our lives where we're really going to decide what hill are we going to die on. See, and I find out in my own convictions that there are very few things that I would die for. But sometimes what happens to us is the magnification. Please get a hold of this. The magnification of the problems that you and I live in becomes so in front of our face that we don't see beyond the problems, and therefore we begin to tear down something that God really might be wanting to build because we just can't get past that issue. To those who do not see the big picture, there usually is one alternative, and that is, I'm going to stay right where I am. This short-sightedness of life is exactly what Paul is teaching to the church at Colossae. You got to look at eternity. You got to think about things that are above. And as a matter of fact, he says this, when these kind of attitudes begin to appear in your life, such as anger, slander. Slander is judging. Malice, greed, sexual immorality appear on our radar scope, and we find out that these are ones that we just can't get over. What has happened to us, now friends, get a hold of this, because if you miss this one, you've missed the whole message. If we don't get over this, it's simply because our eyes have shifted off the eternal to the temporal. And we're thinking much more about the temporal, and that's exactly what Paul's trying to get across here. Guys, you got to come back to see that your life is being played. As a matter of fact, this is the testing ground for eternity. This is it. This is what it's all about. And he's saying, if you want to deal with it, you got to deal with it here. And then there's something that begins to happen when we take our eyes off the problems. Anybody here with problems? 6 of us. Same 6 vote every week. But the idea of it is that all of us have problems, and the question is going to be asked, in 100 years from now, what kind of an influence did that problem have upon your eternity? See? And that's something that Paul's trying to get across to the people. Think about things that are above. As a matter of fact, the Bible makes it really clear that our life is like a vapor. It comes and it goes. Well, I wish I had time tonight to tell you about how quickly my life has gone by. It is just, every time I'm around my kids, you know, even looking back, and I don't do this very often, but even looking back at high school annuals, man, I can think of days that I had in high school, and it was like it was yesterday. And now, I've got a lot more days behind me than I do ahead of me. And it's just that stark reality that we live our lives, not just for the moment, but we live it for eternity. You with me? Colossians chapter 3, verse 1. Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge in the image of the Creator. Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Have your little outlines you want to follow along? Let's take a look at some reminders of values that are eternal. Number one is this: identify the differences between genuine and false nurture. And people, let me just tell you this. Stop and think about this one for a minute. Identify in your own life tonight what is false and what is genuine. Because it says here in verse 4, when Christ, who is your life. There are reasons why we do what we do. There is something that activity actually feeds us, and that's why we continue doing it. I don't know if you just heard what I said, but there are reasons why we do what we do. Now, this inner man, which, by the way, friends, our society is really talking about all the wisdom that is in us. And I want you to know what's in us is not wisdom. The inner man is not a good guy. Have you noticed? He is always trying to go some other way, and it is broken. And friends, I do not want to overstate this, but I don't think I could. I don't think we really understand to the degree that all of us are broken from sin. You know, and this idea that you can even trust yourself, you know, and the Bible makes it really clear, don't put any confidence in the flesh. Because you're just not strong enough. None of us are strong enough. And it's this inner man. You know what's wrong with the inner man? Let me just tell you plainly what is wrong with the inner man. The inner man seeks what is best for the moment because he does not see eternity. See? Whatever will get me out of the pain for the moment, that's what I'm into, man. Woo! This will be fun. But he never thinks past the fun and what that's going to cost him. And that's why the inner man has to be trained. That's why, friends, listen to me carefully. The Bible says in Proverbs, there's a way that seems right unto man, but the end thereof is death. And the inner man does this. He's in such pain. For whatever reasons, the church does not even want to acknowledge that people are in pain. And people are in such pain that when they see something come by, it doesn't matter what the vice is. Doesn't matter what it is at all. The inner man goes, that will solve my problem. And then you latch onto that thing, and then you're on a roller coaster ride like you never ever figured out whatever happened in your life. And you think, how in the world did I get here? It's because you entered into listening to the inner man on a false nurture. And Jesus says this, I am the bread. I'm the bread of life. And if you need anything, what your inner man needs is seeking me. Finding out that that's where life is. Friends, it's just like what Ronnie was talking about in his testimony tonight. How many people tonight in River City and last night went out and said, I'm really going to find out what life is all about, and then woke up this morning and found out it wasn't there either? You see, and sometimes, honestly, I feel almost apologetic as a Christian going around and saying, if you really try Jesus, He is that bread that will satisfy for what you are looking for in your life. And so many people today do not understand the difference between false nurture and genuine nurture. But Paul says this, Jesus who is your life. Not a segment of your life, not something you schedule into your life, not something that is conveniently placed on the weekend so that we can say it's over with and then therefore go back to our old ways. It says this, Jesus who is your life. He who is having the Son is having the life. He who is not having the Son is not having the life. You see? And all that is in the backdrop of eternity. This thing is about knowing Jesus, because and friends, let me just say this to you. I know there's going to be a huge amount of Americans that are going to be absolutely disappointed on the day that they go to heaven. I thought I'd get a reaction out of that, man. You just sit there kind of like, well, tell us something new. Okay. And here's what it is, because I think that people are just so caught up with all the gold and all the wonderful things that are there, but Jesus will outshine them all. And you get there and you just realize it's all about Him. The life that you're experiencing now will be the life that you're experiencing then. And if you're not enjoying it now, you won't enjoy it then. It's all about Jesus. It's all about eternity. That's what His life is all about. Number 2 is this. Live in the reality of final accountability. Paul makes this so clear. Live in the reality of the final accountability. Verses 5 and 6. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, now notice this, the wrath of God is coming. Putting to death something that has brought you even false nurture is much more difficult than you would ever dream. I had a friend of mine years ago, really a good friend of mine, that was interviewed on a Christian TV station. And in the interview, she said, Harry, wasn't it easy for you to come to Christ? Kind of that Pollyanna stuff. Anyway. And he looked right at her and said, no, it was the toughest thing in the world I've ever done. I had to give up 32 years of selfishness. And it wasn't easy. I don't know about you, but there's some real truth in that. Just saying, I just walked away from my old life. It says, put to death. Now, some of you may not like where I'm going to go on this, but I've got the microphone, so just hang on. We in this society have decided that capital punishment is a fair judgment. Now, if you don't agree with that, that's fine. You can keep that. But as a society, we have moved that way. And we have given to people, 12 people usually, a panel of people, the right to take another person's life in a judicial sense. And I think all of us experienced that here in this last month with Scott Peterson. And listening to these people, it was no light thing. I mean, listening to some of these jurors that went through the whole process, that it was the worst day of my life. Because I was putting to death, I knew what I was doing, but I felt like the crime was equal to the punishment that we delivered. And here's what really comes to me about this, talking about final accountability. Our society basically says this: if you won't say no to certain activities, we will say no for you. See, and it just, whether you like it or not, that's where we are. And they're just saying, we are not going to put up with somebody that will kill their wife and their unborn child. This is what you get. Now, if you don't like that, you sure won't like this next one. Because God says, if you're going to practice these kind of activities that we just read, then on that ultimate day of final accountability, I will say no for you. I will say no for you. Now, friends, let me tell you exactly where a lot of people are living today. That day will never come. I will never stand before God, and that is the first deception that a lot of people live in. And that's why they can go around and do whatever their escapades are, live in greed, and do all the rest of it, because they have a mindset about this God that he is a Santa Claus. A guy in heaven with a gray beard and just wants you to sit on his lap, but they don't see him as judge. See, and I know that you can get around hellfire and brimstone at this particular time. And friends, I am not interested in that at all. But I am telling you this is exactly what Paul is saying. You got to think in terms of eternity. Because someday, all of us are going to stand before God and give account of what we did in the flesh. You deal with it. Because that is the reality of it. That is what Paul is trying to say. You want to keep practicing these things, and there is coming a day when you're going to have to say, God is going to say, that is not acceptable. And I find out this, it's a lot easier to fall under grace than it is under judgment. Are we connecting? Let's go to point 3. Let's see if that helps. Number 3, learn to reflect upon your new identity. Learn to reflect upon your new identity. And boy, friends, this is a key point. Verse 11, here there is no Greek or Jew. Now think about this. Paul is saying, I want you to think about eternity. Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is in all and is in all. Here's a group of people who have come together from so many different backgrounds and cultures. Huge. Our nationality, then our religion, then our social status. Paul relates all of those attributes to our identity, or to these people's identity. When we have known our identity, and friends, let me tell you something. When you were born, your identity was already declared. Whether you were a male or a female. And then over a period of time, you really started getting an identity from your family, and then from your nation. And then to the social order you are. And over a period of time, that really becomes ingrained in us as to who we are. And when we start thinking about temporal things, then what actually starts to come to the surface again in our hearts and in our minds is what we were before we came to Christ. I want you to know, I'm absolutely proud to be an American. That's my identity. But it is a distant second to my identity with Christ. Now, years ago, in 1977, when we were at the School of Evangelism on staff, Cheryl and I and our kids, one night after a lecture, I just felt like the Lord spoke to me. I want you to take a walk. And it was a night that it had just snowed. And it was a wet snow. And so I just took this walk. And it was a lovely walk because it was by the forest. And so I was walking by there. And I got to a corner where there was a light. I just stopped and was looking at the snow. And you know, when a car would drive by and then it splashes a little dirt on the white snow, there was just a perfect place where just a speck of mud was right in the middle of this white snow. And the Lord just began to speak to me about my identity. And he began to point out to me that my identity really came from, just take this for what it's worth, a lot out of the athletic world. And that was a scar upon me. Not that it was a bad thing, but it was a scar. And here was the real point, is that often what happens to us, friends, at some of those zenith points in our life, when we're young, is when we get identified with who we think that we are. And as a matter of fact, what happens to a lot of people is they can never progress out of that because that's where they live their life, because that's where their identity started. They think that that's the circumference of it all. And the Lord just began to speak to me. I want to make that white because your identity is not back there. Your identity is with me. Your identity, and I'm even ashamed to say this, friends, but there were years when I would go out on teams, whether it was to Afghanistan or Germany or wherever it was, and in my mind I had to identify with that like we were going on a football trip because I had no frame of reference to put this thing in. And saying these people are brothers and sisters in the Lord was just almost too much for me. And the Lord was saying, I want you to move your identity from what it was in the past, and I want you to begin to identify with your family now. I want you to see that. Now, why do I say that? Because I'll tell you exactly why, friends. As a pastor, I don't know how many times I've heard this, when people will say to me, the reason I can't participate in whatever it is that God's called me to is because, Dan, you don't know what my past was. What are you identifying when you say that? That my identity comes from somewhere other than God. And that's where I came up with this statement. The greatest revelation you will ever have in your life is that you're a son or a daughter of the living God. And the reason why that is so important, it will never, ever change. My identity as a pastor will change. But my identity as a son or a daughter of the living God will never, ever change. Now let me just put a bottom line to it. There's a lot of people, because of temporal values, that say, I do not want to identify with the body of Christ. And Paul says, this one lasts for eternity. Doesn't matter if you're Greek. Doesn't matter if you're Jew. Doesn't matter what religion you come from. You're part of the family. And friends, you would not know the barriers that there are in people's lives right now because they just don't want to identify with a local church as the body of Christ. Number 4. Put on eternal attitudes and values. Verse 12. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Paul instructs these people to put on certain attitudes and actions. Now, I would assume that you're much like I am, that when you get up in the morning, there is a certain routine. As a matter of fact, my wife tells me that I am not responsible for anything I say or do for the first 5 minutes. Because I just kind of come together like Humpty Dumpty. I mean, when I'm sleeping, I'm really sleeping, and I do not like the alarm clock. Never have, never will. And so I kind of get up in sections. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I'm Dan. There he is. My God, he's getting old. I got a wife, I got kids, and all that stuff starts coming around, And then we go through this kind of routine. All of us have this kind of routine. And ultimately, we end up dressed. Amen. You're with me now, aren't you? And if I came up to you and say, how did you get your clothes on? You wouldn't go, I don't know. I walked into my closet and zap, they were on. No, we know what we did. We choose our clothes, we put them on. As a matter of fact, my family will not let me shop alone for my own clothes. And so I have to go incognito. Because I do not, as a matter of fact, Cheryl tells me the only taste I have is in my mouth, so leave the choosing of the clothes up to me. Matter of fact, John and I were out shopping for Christmas, and I was looking at sweaters. And I'd pick one up, and he'd just go, put it back down, Dad. So anyway, you know how it goes. And the reason why, friends, is this. I mean, Paul talks about this. Put this on, take that off, put this on, take that off. Is because we look better in certain clothes than we do in other ones. It's that simple. And here's what Paul is saying. You look a lot better in eternal attitudes and values than you do in temporal ones. Put these on. Every morning, just like when you get up and dress, put on humility. Put on patience. Put on love. Put these things on. And then you're living in eternal values. Number 5 is this. Trust Christ's help when making difficult decisions. Verse 15, let the peace of Christ rule. Important word here, rule, in your hearts. This word rule here is much like we would allow an umpire to make a call in a baseball game. We all find ourselves, now friends, I have chosen a word here carefully. We have all found ourselves being pulled, in the word that I have chosen, in two different directions in our lives. Every one of us. Sometimes those decisions are a lot more important than other ones, but we find this dynamic that's taken place in our lives that we are actually being pulled in two different directions. Now let me suggest to you thinking how you're being pulled and how I'm being pulled. You're being pulled by the temporal, the temporary. And Paul comes along and says, let Christ rule in your heart. See, we get to these places in our lives, friend, and we just simply don't know what to do. Any of you here like that? You just get to a place and you seek counsel, you do all the things, and I guarantee you that when we really come down to the bottom line as to what we're actually going to make a decision on, it usually has to do with temporal or eternal values. And Christ being so good, and Paul understanding this dynamic so well, he says, let him make the call. Now, let me just, Ron, you guys can come on up. Let me just tell you this. The biggest trouble I have ever gotten myself into in my life, and by the way, it is not over, is when I decide, and I know at the time of what I am doing is not what I'm supposed to be doing. And I'm not talking about any kind of overt sin. I'm just talking about to a place of saying in my life, I just want it Dan's way, rather than allowing Christ to rule in my heart at that time. Now, here's the strange thing about that, friends, is that then it says the peace. You know what the absence of peace is? Turmoil. You know what turmoil is? It's not fun to live in. It's painful. And then all of us have had those examples too when we go, I'm just going to do what's right. And you decide to do what's right, and then what you find out from there is what? Peace. Because you haven't followed the temporal mindset. You have followed eternal values. Now, friends, it's starting 2005, as all of us are starting. My prayer for myself, as well as this church, is this, is that we will make choices in 2005 in view of eternal values. Let's stand together. Let's worship the Lord.